There was a particular way a crowd went quiet when everyone in it had decided, together and without agreement, to pretend they were not watching a man they had spent 2 years pretending did not exist. He had learned to recognize that quiet the way other men learned to recognize weather. He knew it in the set of shoulders. He knew it in the sudden, careful interest people took in their own gloved hands. He was standing in the middle of it now, beneath 3 great oaks in the Whitcombs' long meadow, surrounded by people who had come to remember the ones the fire had taken. 3 minutes ago, he had made a decision he could not yet decide whether to regret. He had not planned to speak. If he was honest, he had planned to stand near the back with his collar high and the scarred side of his face angled away from the nearest eyes, as he had stood near the back of every public gathering he had entered in 2 years. That was the plan that had kept him alive, in the smaller sense of the word, since the stable roof came down. The plan had not accounted for her being there too, plainly visible beside the small Fenwick table, watching him without pity and without pretending not to watch at all. He found her before he found his own voice. She was not looking at him with the expression he had catalogued over 2 years, into every possible variation people wore when they looked at him. She was looking at him the way she had looked at him from the first week she came to the house, like a man who owed a report on the household accounts, and nothing else. It should not have been enough to undo him. It was. 2 months earlier, hearing his name had meant something very different to her, something older than Fenwick Grange, something she had spent 6 years refusing to explain even to herself. Nora Fairweather had learned, over the 11 months since her brother's latest debts became public knowledge, that desperation had a particular arithmetic. It did not ask what a woman was willing to do. It asked only what she had left to lose, and then it took that too, briskly, without apology, as a shopkeeper takes payment. What she had left, by the time the agency in Bath sent word of a position at a place called Fenwick Grange, was very little. A mother whose nerves had not recovered from the scandal. 2 younger sisters who still needed to eat and to be married eventually, and to be spared if it could be managed. The indignity of watching their family's name spoken in a room and observing which faces turned away. A brother who wrote, when he wrote at all, only to ask for money he had no plan of repaying. So when the woman at the agency, a thin, efficient person named Mrs. Alsop, who did not waste sympathy on clients who could not afford to pay for it, told her that the housekeeper's post at Fenwick Grange came with a wage nearly double the going rate, on account of no one wanting to stay in it, Nora had asked exactly one question. Why does no one want to stay? The master keeps to himself, Mrs. Alsop had said, in the tone of a woman reciting something she had recited many times before. Some kind of accident some years back. He does not receive. The last 3 housekeepers left within the season, 1 within the fortnight, on account of nerves or superstition, or I couldn't say what. If you are the sort of person given to nerves or superstition, Miss Fairweather, I'd advise you look elsewhere. Nora was not, by that point in her life, the sort of person who could afford nerves. She had taken the position by letter, sight unseen, on the strength of the wage alone, and had told herself the whole 3 days of travel that whatever waited for her at Fenwick Grange could not possibly be worse than what she had already survived. The house, when the hired trap finally turned up the drive, did not look haunted so much as abandoned mid-thought. Ivy had been allowed to close over half the west wing's windows, like a hand closing over a wound. The gravel had gone to weed. Somewhere beyond the stables, rebuilt she would learn later, though never quite finished, as though the builders themselves had lost heart partway through. A dog was barking at nothing in particular. She was met at the door not by a housekeeper, since there was none, nor by a butler, since the last one had retired the year before and never been replaced, but by a broad, gray-templed man in a plain coat who introduced himself as Mr. Aldrich, steward of the estate, and looked at her with the flat, assessing patience of someone testing whether a bridge would hold his weight before committing his full stride to it. "You're younger than I expected," he said, which was hardly an insult, delivered as it was without any real unkindness. "The agency does like to send me young ones. I expect they think a young woman will be too proud to leave without finishing out her contract. They are usually wrong." "I don't intend to leave, Mr. Aldrich." "No," he agreed. "None of them intend to." He walked her through the house as he said it, through rooms under Holland covers, through a kitchen that had clearly not seen a full staff in years, through a library whose shelves had been reorganized by someone with more grief than method. He did not soften what he told her, which she came to respect in him almost immediately, because so few people in her life recently had thought her owed the truth undiluted. "He came to the title only 4 years back," Aldrich added, in the same flat, informational tone he used for everything else about the house. "His elder brother died of a fever the same year his father followed him, neither death anything to do with what came after. His Grace had scarcely finished mourning the pair of them before the fire took the rest of what peace he had left. His Grace does not leave the North Tower," he went on, "has not, in any meaningful sense, in 2 years. He takes his meals sent up. He conducts what business he must conduct through me, or through correspondence he does not enjoy writing. The staff who remain have learned not to remark upon it, and I'll ask the same of you." "And if I'm required to attend him directly?" "Housekeeping duties reach every room in a house, I should think, even ones a master doesn't wish attended." Something in Mr. Aldrich's face changed, something short of approval, though perhaps the beginning of it. "You'll be required, yes. More than the last 3 managed. And I'll tell you now what I've learned to tell every girl who lasts long enough to hear it. He does not want your pity, Miss Fairweather, and he can smell it on a person before they've said a word. Don't knock like you're asking his forgiveness for existing. Don't lower your eyes if you happen to see more of him than you expected to see. Speak to him about the household the way you'd speak to any man who owed you an answer about the household, and you will likely last longer than a fortnight. And if I can't manage that, then you'll leave like the others, and I'll write to the agency for someone new, and we'll have this conversation again with some other girl standing where you're standing." He said it without cruelty. It seemed to Nora, in fact, that Mr. Aldrich had simply run out of energy for softening things, as a man runs out of coal partway through a hard winter and stops apologizing for the cold. By her second day, she had learned the staff's private name for the man she had not yet been permitted to see. The scullery maid, a round-faced girl of perhaps 16 named Peg, used it without thinking, as one uses any word repeated often enough to lose its weight. "Mind the west stair after dark," Peg told her, over the washing. "The beast don't like company on the west stair after dark." "He is not a beast," Nora said, more sharply than she had intended. "He is your employer, and mine, and I'll thank you to speak of him as such in my hearing." Peg went pink and quiet, and did not use the word again in front of her, though Nora suspected it continued freely enough behind her back. She found she did not much care. She had not come to Fenwick Grange to make herself liked by the kitchen staff. She had come to keep a roof over 3 other women's heads, and if that meant being the sort of housekeeper who corrected scullery maids and asked steady questions of gray-faced stewards, she would be that woman without apology. It was on her 4th night, past 11, going over the household accounts by a single candle in the small office off the kitchen passage, that she heard it. The sound came from somewhere above and to the north, slow and uneven, not quite footsteps, more like the deliberate shifting of something heavy being moved and set down, at an hour when the rest of the house had long gone still. Peg had told her, in her breathless way, that the last housekeeper but one had heard sounds from the tower at night and never gone up to investigate again for the whole of her employment, on the theory that whatever made the sound was better left to make it in peace. Nora sat with her pen still in her hand and listened to it for a long moment. That patient, effortful sound, over and over, like a man teaching himself something his own hands no longer wanted to do. She thought of the wage and what it would mean for her sisters. She thought of Mr. Aldridge's flat, tired voice, telling her not to knock like she was asking forgiveness. She thought with more irritation at herself than at anyone else that she had come 3 days by post-chaise and hired trap specifically so as not to be the sort of woman who tiptoed around a closed door for a wage she badly needed. She did not go up that night. It was not yet her place, and she was not yet fool enough to invite a dismissal in her first week over simple curiosity. But she set down her pen, and she did not flinch at the sound again. And when it came a second time, and a third, she found she was listening to it the way one listens to a neighbor's habit rather than a threat. Something to be understood in time rather than feared in the dark. She would meet him properly within the week. She did not yet know that the name the staff refused to speak with any warmth belonged to a man she had once known. A lifetime before any of this. Under circumstances she had spent 6 years trying very hard not to remember. The tower room was not what Nora had built in her imagination over 4 nights of listening to it through the ceiling. She had pictured, without quite meaning to, something closer to a sick room. Shuttered, close, thick with the stale smell of a place that had given up being aired. 4 nights of listening to the sound overhead had built her a picture of the man who made it. Hunched, perhaps, or bedridden, or kept in the dark the way certain animals were kept in the dark, for their own comfort or for the comfort of whoever did not wish to look at them. What she found instead, when she climbed the last of the narrow stair on the 5th morning with the roof accounts under her arm, was a room with 2 tall windows uncovered to the gray daylight, a fire built high enough to be wasteful, and a long table entirely given over to what looked, at first glance, like the disassembled insides of a dozen clocks. The room smelled of oil and coal smoke and, faintly, of the beeswax someone still troubled to use on the floor, which told her more than any warning downstairs had managed. Whoever lived here had not stopped living. He had only stopped being seen. She knocked once, because Mr. Aldridge had told her to knock like she meant it, and not like she was asking permission to exist. And she did not wait for an answer before she opened the door, because she had spent the whole climb up deciding that this, precisely, was the test she intended to pass. Who let you up here? It was not a question so much as a statement of displeasure, delivered without turning around, in a voice pitched low and even, the voice of a man who had long ago stopped expecting to be obeyed and had settled instead for being avoided. No one let me, Your Grace. I climbed the stairs myself. I've 3 matters requiring your signature, and I understood from Mr. Aldridge that letters left outside your door have a habit of going unread for a fortnight. He turned then. She had been warned. In the vague and skittering way the staff warned each other of things they did not wish to say plainly, and she had told herself on the climb up that she was prepared for whatever the warning had been circling around without naming. She found, in the moment itself, that the warning had prepared her for very little. The warning had been about his face and his hands, and the ruin the fire had left across the right side of both. What she had not been warned about, what no one had thought to mention, because it apparently did not occur to the staff of Fenwick Grange as a fact worth reporting, was that he was, underneath what the fire had done to him, not old. Younger than she had expected. Younger, if she allowed herself the thought at all, than she was prepared for. She did not permit her face to do anything at all. This was, she would reflect later, the single most useful skill 11 months of watching her family's ruin be discussed in drawing rooms had taught her. The ability to hold an expression level while everything behind it moved. She had practiced it first in her mother's parlor, keeping her face composed, while acquaintances arranged their own into careful, performed sympathy that was really only curiosity wearing a better coat. She had not expected to find a use for the same discipline on the far side of a scandal in a stranger's tower, but a face schooled into blankness answered to the same rules wherever it was asked to hold. "You're new," he said, when she did not flinch, did not soften her eyes, did not do any of the several things his face seemed built, by long practice, to detect and catalog in a stranger. "I arrived Tuesday. And no one told you what you'd find up here. They told me you kept to the tower and did not care to be attended to as though you were dying. I am not here to attend you, Your Grace. I'm here about the east roof, which is dying, considerably more urgently than you appear to be, and which will cost considerably more to repair in the spring than it would to repair now, before the frost gets further into the timber." Something crossed his face that she could not immediately name. Not offense, though she had half expected offense, and not the wounded, waiting silence she associated from Aldridge's warnings with the housekeepers who had come before her. It looked, if she had to put a word to it, like confusion, as if she had answered a question in a language he had stopped expecting anyone to speak. "You didn't look away." "I beg your pardon?" "Just now, when I turned round. You didn't look away, and you didn't do the other thing. The thing where a person makes a great show of not looking away, which is worse. You looked at me the way you'd look at anyone standing in your way of a roof needing mending." Nora considered several answers and discarded most of them as either too honest or too glib. What she settled on was simple, because simple was, in her experience, the answer least likely to invite further conversation on a subject she had no intention of discussing with an employer she had known for 4 days. "I've a great deal to accomplish in this house, Your Grace, and very little time in the day to accomplish it. I find I haven't the leisure to spend it staring." He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the first genuine flicker of unease since she'd climbed the stair, not because of anything alarming in his expression, but because of how closely he seemed to be looking, with the unsettled attention of someone who suspects he has seen the shape of a puzzle before and cannot place where. "The others didn't manage it," he said, half to himself, as if continuing a thought she hadn't been invited into. "Whatever it is you're doing, the last one curtsied at the door and would not come past the threshold for a month. The one before that cried, the first time, and then apologized for crying, which I found worse than the crying itself. I haven't the time for either, Nora said. I hope that isn't a disappointment. It is a great many things. I haven't decided yet whether disappointment is among them. What's your name? Fairweather. Nora Fairweather. Nothing in his face changed at the name. No recognition, no pause. Nothing but the mild, distracted attention of a man filing away a fact he expected to need later for household correspondence. She felt something in her chest unclench a fraction and told herself it was relief and did not examine the feeling any further than that. Leave the papers on the table, Miss Fairweather. Not there. You'll bury the escapement I've been 3 nights setting right. There. She crossed the room to set the roof accounts where he'd indicated, and it was only in crossing it that she let herself look, briefly and without staring, at the table full of clockwork he had been so protective of a moment before. Dozens of small brass parts, laid out with a precision that spoke of hours of patient, exacting work that did not match, she thought, and then immediately stopped herself from thinking further. The picture the staff downstairs had painted of a man who did nothing at all up here but brood. You'll have my answer on the roof by evening, he said, already turning back to the table, dismissing her the way a man dismisses most conversations when he's unused to needing more than a handful of words to end one. Was there anything else? No, Your Grace. Then you may go the way you came. Quickly, if you don't mind. You've let the cold in. She went. She did not hurry, because hurrying would have been its own kind of flinch, and she had promised herself on the stair that she would not give this house or this man the satisfaction of a single flinch in her first fortnight. It was only once the door had shut behind her, and she was halfway down the narrow stair, that she allowed her hands, for exactly the length of 10 steps, to shake. Alone in the tower room, Alistair Renshaw stood with his ruined hand flat on the table, over the small, ordered ranks of gears he had not managed in 3 nights to put back together correctly, and found that he could not return his attention to them. It was not her face. He was nearly certain of that, nearly, though not entirely, and the small, uncertain remainder of it nagged at him in a way he did not care for. It was something in the voice, or in the unhurried way she had crossed the room, unbothered, as if the room and the man in it were simply facts to be dealt with, and not obstacles to be feared. He had met a great many people in his life before the fire. He told himself this was all it was, the ordinary, meaningless familiarity of a crowded past, a face that resembled some other face at some other gathering he could no longer place. He told himself this for the better part of an hour, and did not entirely believe it, and eventually gave up on the clockwork for the day, and stood instead at the window, watching the drive below, with an attention he had not given it in longer than he cared to admit. The letter came on a Thursday, tucked in among the household correspondence Aldridge left for her sorting, and she knew her brother's hand before she had fully broken the seal. That hurried, slanting script that always looked, to her eye, like a man writing faster than his conscience could keep up with him. She did not read it standing in the passage where anyone might see her face change. She took it to the small office off the kitchen, shut the door, and read it there, alone, as she had learned to read anything from Silas. "Dearest Nora," it began, which was itself a bad sign, because Silas only remembered to call her dearest when he wanted something he knew he had no right to ask for. He was in Bristol. He did not say why he was in Bristol, which told her a great deal on its own. Since the last, she had heard he was meant to be in London, taking the clerking position their uncle had arranged for him, at considerable cost to family pride, already threadbare from spending. He had fallen in with, his words, a promising circle of investors. The investment had not, in the end, been promising. He required, by the end of the month, a sum that made Nora sit down hard in the office chair and read the figure twice to be certain she had not misread it in the poor light. "I would not ask," the letter went on, "if there were any other way. You know I would not ask." She knew nothing of the kind. She had watched Silas ask over and over for 4 years running, each time with the same aggrieved sincerity, each time promising it was the last, each time proving it was not. She had watched her mother's savings go to the first debt and her own small inheritance from their grandmother go to the second. Packing her single trunk for Fenwick Grange, she had told herself that this position, this wage, doubled on account of a man's grief no one wanted to sit with, was meant to be the thing that finally put distance between her family's future and her brother's habits. The wage from a single quarter would not cover what the letter asked for, not close to it. She folded the letter along its old creases, twice over, and put it in the bottom of her writing box beneath the household ledgers, where she kept the handful of things she did not wish found by a passing maid with more curiosity than discretion. And she went back to her work because there was nothing else, in that moment, to be done with the fact of it. It was 2 days later, while she was overseeing the airing of the good linens in the long gallery, a task the house had clearly not seen attended to in some years, judging by the state of the presses, that she first heard the name Lady Prudence Halloway spoken in Fenwick Grange, and heard it, as it happened, from the mouth of the dowager herself. Constance Renshaw arrived without much warning, as she apparently made a habit of doing, in a carriage that announced itself from a good distance by the impatient pace it kept up the drive. She was a tall woman, silver-haired, handsome in the settled way of someone who had once been beautiful and had simply allowed the beauty to change shape rather than disappear. And she moved through her son's neglected house with the brisk, faintly injured air of a woman visiting a wound she was tired of being told not to touch. She found Aldridge in the estate office and did not trouble to lower her voice, and Nora, folding linen in the gallery 2 doors down, with the door left ajar for the draft, heard most of it without meaning to. "The Whitcombs are holding the memorial in October," the dowager was saying. "For the fire. All the families who lost someone will be there, and half the county besides. And I will not have my son remembered as the man who could not be troubled to attend a service for his own stable boy. He has attended nothing in 2 years, Your Grace. I don't know that October changes that. October changes it because I intend to make it change it. And I have had a very sensible thought on the matter, Aldridge, which I'd ask you not to discourage before I've had the chance to see it through. Lady Prudence Halloway." A pause, in which Nora imagined Aldridge's face doing the careful, neutral thing it did whenever he disagreed with something he had not been asked to disagree with. "A quiet girl," the dowager went on, "undemanding. Her family's estate borders the Whitcombs, so she'll be at the memorial regardless. And I have it on good authority she does not startle easily and does not gossip, which is more than I can say for most girls her age. She would not require him to be—" She paused, choosing a kinder word than the one she had first reached for. "More than he is presently capable of being. A sensible arrangement, companionable. No one asking him to perform feelings he has plainly decided he no longer has the use for. That's a great deal to arrange around one evening at a memorial service, Your Grace. It is a great deal to arrange around 2 years of watching my son disappear a little further into that tower every season, Aldridge," and I find I have run out of patience for waiting on a better plan to present itself." Nora set down the linen she was folding and did not pick it up again for some time. She told herself, standing in the gallery with the smell of lavender and cedar shavings around her, that it was none of her concern how the dowager chose to arrange her son's future, and that a housekeeper who involved herself in the private matchmaking of the family she served was a housekeeper who did not last the season. She told herself this several times, in fact, with the firmness of a person trying to talk herself out of a feeling she has not yet examined closely enough to name. What she could not entirely talk herself out of was the small, specific unease that had settled somewhere beneath her ribs at the phrase, "No one asking him to perform feelings he has plainly decided he no longer has the use for." It was not, she thought, an accurate description of the man she had stood in front of 5 days before. The man with the clockwork laid out in patient, exacting rows. The man who had looked at her the way one looks at a puzzle rather than a curiosity. It was a description of a man someone had decided he was, for the sake of a sensible arrangement, rather than a man anyone had troubled to actually see. That evening, after the house had gone quiet and the last of the linens were put away, she took Silas's letter out from beneath the ledgers and read it again by candlelight, twice through, and then a third time. It was as though a fourth reading might change the figure at the bottom of the page, or the month it was due, or the simple helplessness of being asked again to solve a problem that was never truly hers to have made in the first place. It did not change. She put it away again and blew out the candle and lay a long while in the dark before sleep found her, turning over 2 separate arithmetics of desperation that had, until that week, belonged to 2 entirely separate lives. She had not meant to go up. It was past 1 in the morning, and she had been lying awake doing the particular arithmetic that had become her nightly habit since Silas's letter. Wages against debts, quarters against months. The number of ways a woman might make an impossible sum possible if she was clever enough or tired enough to stop noticing it was impossible. Then she heard, from somewhere above, a sound sharper than the familiar patient shifting she had grown used to over 3 weeks. A clatter. Metal against wood. And then a low, exhausted word she did not quite catch, but understood perfectly well by its tone. She was out of bed and halfway into her dressing gown before she had fully decided to go, telling herself it was the smell of hot metal she was worried about, in a house that had already burned once, and nothing closer to the man himself than that. The stair at that hour was a different stair than the one she climbed by daylight, colder, steeper somehow, lit only by whatever moon found its way through the narrow, slit windows the builders had thought sufficient for a tower nobody was meant to occupy for 2 years running. She had climbed it twice by day since her arrival, and never once by night, and she found herself moving more quietly than the errand strictly required, as if some part of her understood, before the rest of her had caught up, that what she was about to see was not meant for daylight eyes either. The tower door was open, a hand's width, which it had not been on any of her previous visits. Through the gap, she could see him at the long table, a single branch of candles burned down close to the socket, his sleeves pushed back and his jaw fixed with the tightness of a man attempting, for perhaps the 40th time, a task his hands were refusing to let him finish. She knocked once against the doorframe, the way she always did, and did not wait to be invited before she spoke. "You'll set the table alight if that candle burns any lower." "I'm aware." He did not look up. His right hand, the scarred one, the one he kept, she had noticed without remarking on it, angled slightly away from most conversations, was closed around a screwdriver no bigger than a hairpin, and it was shaking, not badly, but enough that the tiny brass screw it was meant to be turning had twice now skittered off the table entirely. "What is it you're building?" "Not building, mending." He said it the way a man corrects a small but important inaccuracy, the kind that mattered to him, even at 1 in the morning with his hand refusing to cooperate. It was my father's, a carriage clock. It stopped the week of the fire, and no one has troubled to see to it since, because there was no one left who knew how, and I did not care to send it out to a stranger to have his hands inside it. "And now you mean to do it yourself." I used to be quite good at this. It was not said with any self-pity that she could detect, more the flat, factual tone of a man reporting a change in the weather. Watches, small mechanisms. My old tutor said I had the patience for it, which was meant as a compliment, and which I did not appreciate at the time, being 16, and wanting to be told I had a talent for something more impressive than patience. What did you want to be told you had a talent for at 16? Horses, cards, the usual catalog of things a 16-year-old mistakes for character. A ghost of something almost like humor crossed his face and was gone again before she could be certain she'd seen it. I came round to the clocks eventually. It's a slower kind of vanity, wanting to be the only man in a room who can put something small and complicated back in order. But it is vanity all the same, and I miss it more than I expected to, now that my hands have decided to make a joke of the whole enterprise. The screwdriver slipped again. This time, the small brass screw went further, rolling off the edge of the table entirely and vanishing somewhere into the shadow beneath it. And he set the tool down with a controlled, careful precision that told her more about his temper than any outburst would have. Nora did not offer sympathy. She had turned the thought over already, walking up the stair, and had decided against it before she'd reached the top. Decided that a man who did not want pity from housekeepers who wept at his doorway would not want it from one who held her composure either, dressed up in gentler words. What she offered instead was practical. Where does it usually go when it's whole? He looked at her properly then, for the first time since she'd come in. "I beg your pardon?" "The screw. Where does it sit when the mechanism's together? If you show me, I can hold the piece steady while you turn it. 4 hands manage a small screw better than 2, whatever the size of either pair." He was quiet long enough that she wondered if she'd misjudged it, if practical was, after all, its own kind of intrusion, dressed differently than pity, but amounting to the same unwanted attention. Then he reached across the table, found a small brass plate among the ordered rows of parts, and set it in front of the single chair opposite his own. "There. Hold it flat, and don't let it tip toward the candle, or you'll have wax in the escapement, and then we'll both be here until dawn." She sat, and held the plate as instructed, and for a long while neither of them spoke. He found the screw eventually, on his hands and knees beneath the table with a candle held low, and came up with dust on his sleeve, and something close to embarrassment, which he did not comment on, and which she did not remark upon either. The work itself was slow. His hand shook less when it had a fixed point to brace against. The edge of the plate she held steady, her fingers close enough to his that she could feel the small tremor pass and settle, as he coaxed the screw into its seat. She did not ask why his hand shook. She assumed, correctly, that the answer would be the same unremarkable answer as everything else about him. An old injury, healed as much as it was going to heal, doing what old injuries did to hands that asked more precision of themselves than they were currently able to give. "There," he said, finally, when the screw seated and the small mechanism beneath it clicked once, faintly, into place. That's the escapement done. It won't run yet. There's a spring wants replacing, and I haven't found one the right size. But it won't fall apart on me either, which is more than I could say an hour ago. Your father's clock. My father's clock. He sat back, and for the first time since she'd come up the stair, something in his shoulders eased that had nothing to do with the mechanism. He was not, by most accounts, a particularly warm man. But he gave me this the year I turned 12 and told me a man ought to know how a thing works before he's trusted to be in charge of it. I don't know that he meant it as more than an offhand remark. I've thought about it far more than an offhand remark deserves these 2 years. Nora said nothing to that. She had learned in 3 weeks at Fenwick Grange that the man across the table did not want his silences filled the way most people wanted silences filled, did not want a housekeeper's gentle reassurance dropped into the gap like a coin into a beggar's cup. She simply held the small brass plate a moment longer than she strictly needed to, until he reached over and took it from her hands to set it back among its ordered rows, and in the taking, his fingers, the scarred ones, brushed hers briefly, without either of them remarking on it. You didn't ask, he said after a moment, in a different register than the rest of the conversation, quieter, as though testing whether the observation was safe to make aloud. Ask what? Why it shakes. Everyone asks eventually. Aldridge didn't, the first year, and I thought him remarkably restrained for it, and then I realized he simply already knew and hadn't needed to. I assumed it was the fire, she said. I didn't think the particulars were mine to ask for, unless you wanted to give them. They're not particularly interesting particulars. A beam came down across it before I could get the last of the stable hands clear. It healed as much as it intends to heal, which is not entirely, and it does not care to be rushed on cold nights or after an hour of fine work. And it has made something of a habit of dropping small screws at the worst possible moment, as you've now had the pleasure of witnessing firsthand. Then it's fortunate, Nora said, that I've nowhere pressing to be at 1 in the morning. He did not answer that directly, but something in the line of his shoulders eased further, and he did not immediately return to the mechanism, content for a moment simply to sit with the candle guttering low between them. The candle had burned another finger's width down by the time she rose to go. Neither of them had said very much more. It did not, she found, walking back down the narrow stair to her own cold bed, feel like a silence that needed apologizing for. And it was a long while, lying awake afterward, before she let herself admit what had unsettled her most about the hour. It was not the shake in his hand, nor the scars the candlelight had not troubled to hide. It was how ordinary it had felt to sit across a table from him, holding a small piece of brass in place while he worked. She recognized the feeling, if she was honest with herself, from a much younger version of this same man, in a much younger version of her own life, when steadying something for him had felt like the easiest thing in the world, rather than the most dangerous. He came on a market day when half the household was down in the village, and the drive was quiet enough that his shouting carried clear across the gravel and in through the kitchen windows, before anyone had properly registered a stranger had arrived at all. Nora heard her own name first. Nora Fairweather, I know you're in there, and was out of the scullery and across the yard before she had fully thought through what she meant to do when she reached him. Only that she meant to reach him before anyone else did. Silas was leaning against the gatepost in a coat that had clearly not been brushed in some days, his hat missing entirely, his color high in a way that told her, before she was close enough to smell the drink on him, exactly what sort of afternoon this was going to be. "There she is." He said it too loudly, the way drunk men said everything too loudly, as if volume might substitute for the coherence he'd misplaced somewhere on the road from Bristol. "There's my sister, tucked away in a duke's own house, and not a word sent to say she'd landed so well." Silas. She kept her voice low, in the hope that low might be contagious, and took his arm to turn him bodily away from the house, toward the lane and whatever privacy the hedgerow might afford them. "You cannot be here. You cannot be here like this. I wrote you a fortnight past. You never answered. I'm answering now. Come away from the house and I'll answer you properly." He did not come away easily. He had the stubbornness of a man who had spent his coach fare on the coach and the remainder of his money on whatever had put the color in his face. He had arrived, therefore, with nothing left to lose by making a scene, and everything to gain, in his own reckoning, by making it loudly enough that someone with means might be shamed into solving his problem for him. "I only want what's owed," he said, louder again, and this time she heard, with a cold drop in her stomach, that his voice had carried past the gatepost and into the yard proper, where a stable hand had paused with a bucket in each hand to watch, unashamed, with the frank interest of someone handed a spectacle for free. A man in a house like this can spare it and never notice the gap. It isn't as though anyone up there's got use for the money. It isn't as though anyone up there's got use for much of anything, from what I hear in the village. A duke who won't leave his tower, and my own sister sent to keep house for a ghost. That is enough. She had never, in 11 months of managing him, raised her voice to Silas in public, and the shock of doing it now seemed to land on him more than any quieter argument had managed in a year. He blinked. His mouth, opened around whatever came next, closed again. It was in that pause, into the sudden quiet of the yard, that she became aware of a third presence. Not the stable hand, who had already resumed his pretense of not watching, but a figure at the edge of the drive, near enough to have heard most of it, dressed too plainly to have been noticed arriving and standing too still to have been mistaken for staff. Alastair did not often come as far as the drive. She would learn later that the noise itself had drawn him, that a raised voice at Fenwick Grange in daylight was rare enough these 2 years to pull him halfway down the tower stair before he'd fully decided to come the rest of the way. He was looking not at Silas, whose face meant nothing to him, but at her, with an expression she could not immediately read, and did not have the composure, in that moment, to try very hard to read. She got Silas away within the quarter hour. She pressed the little she had put by from her wages into his hand, told him it was the last, and told him she meant it this time, in a voice that both of them understood to be a lie the moment it left her mouth. Then she watched him go unsteadily back down the lane toward whatever coach or cart would carry him back to Bristol, and whatever fresh trouble waited for him there. She did not see Alastair again until evening, when she brought the household accounts up to the tower as she did most nights now, a habit that had begun with clockwork and continued, unremarked upon by either of them, well past the point where the accounts strictly required it. He did not ask about Silas directly. She had braced for a direct question the whole climb up the stair, and found, instead, something more careful, which unsettled her more than bluntness would have. "That was your brother?" "Yes." "He said your name as though he expected the house to know it already, as though it ought to mean something to someone here. He was drunk, Your Grace. Drunk men say a great deal that doesn't bear examining. I didn't ask whether it bore examining. I asked why it sounded for exactly as long as he was shouting it, as though he expected an answer from somewhere other than you. She kept her face composed, the way she had learned to in her mother's parlor a lifetime ago, and gave him the only answer she could give without giving him the whole of it. "I couldn't say what my brother expects, Your Grace. He rarely knows himself." It was not, strictly, a lie. It was also not, she knew even as she said it, an answer. And she saw, in the small, unsatisfied set of his jaw, that he knew it too, and that whatever patience had let the matter rest after their first meeting in this room had thinned, in the space of a single afternoon, to something considerably less forgiving. He was quiet a moment, and when he spoke again, it was in a different register entirely, as if he had decided, mid-thought, that he had no particular reason to keep the matter from her, and every reason to say it aloud to someone who was not his mother. "My mother has written with a proposal," he said. "Formally this time, not the usual hinting she does at Christmas and lets drop again by spring. She has a candidate in mind for me, Lady Prudence Halliway. I gather she is quiet and does not gossip, and would not ask more of a husband than a husband in my present condition can reasonably be expected to give." Nora kept her hands very still on the ledger's edge. "And what does Your Grace intend to answer?" "I haven't decided. It has the considerable advantage of being simple. No one expecting anything of me beyond civility and an heir eventually. No one troubling themselves to look past." He made a small, economical gesture toward the scarred side of his own face, the first time she had seen him refer to it directly, without flinching from the reference himself. "Any of this. It would solve my mother's difficulty at the memorial in October very tidily. She could stand beside me and call it settled." "Is settled the same as content, Your Grace?" "I don't know that I've the right to ask for content anymore. Settled may have to serve." He said it without self-pity, in the same flat register he used for most things, which made it, to her ear, harder to hear than if he had said it bitterly. "Very well," he went on, before she could find an answer for that, and the different register closed over again like water over a stone. "Leave the ledger. I've a letter from my mother to answer, and I find I've very little appetite left tonight for anything requiring further explanation." She left. It was only once she'd reached the bottom of the stair that she allowed herself to wonder, with a dread that had nothing to do with Silas at all, what precisely his mother's letter contained, and how much longer she had before the second half of that day's trouble found its way up to the tower, as surely as the first half already had. He did not send for the ledger the next evening, nor the one after that. Nora told herself this meant nothing in particular. A man was entitled to an evening, or 3, without the company of his housekeeper and a stack of household accounts he had never truly needed help understanding. She told herself this while she sat in the small office off the kitchen passage at the hour she had, without quite admitting it to herself, begun to think of as theirs, and did not climb the tower stair uninvited, because uninvited was precisely the thing she had promised herself. That first week, she would never allow herself to become. By the 4th evening, Aldridge found her in the linen gallery with a look on his face she had not seen from him before. Not quite pity, which she would not have tolerated, but something adjacent to it, a kind of weary caution. "His Grace has written to his mother," he said, without preamble, because preamble was not a thing Aldridge dealt in. "Accepting the introduction to Lady Prudence Halliway. He means to receive her family at the memorial in October, formally, as a beginning." Nora kept folding the linen in her hands, with a steadiness that cost her more than she let show. "That's his prerogative, Mr. Aldridge." "It is. I only tell you because you've a way of finding things out regardless, and I'd rather you heard it plain from me than pieced together from the kitchen." He studied her a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "You've done more for that man in 6 weeks than the last 3 housekeepers managed between them, Miss Fairweather. I'll say that much and no more, and you may do with it what you like." She did not know what to do with it. She turned it over for the rest of the day, folding it alongside the linens, and did not arrive at anything that resembled peace. In the tower, in those same 4 evenings, Alistair had arrived at a different reckoning entirely, though he would not have called it a reckoning if asked. He would have called it sense finally reasserting itself after 6 weeks of something that had felt, while it was happening, dangerously like hope. He had let a housekeeper hold a brass plate, steady, while his hand shook. He had told her, unprompted, about his mother's letter, about Lady Prudence, about the tidy arithmetic of a marriage that asked nothing of him but civility. Watching Nora across the candlelight as he said it, he had felt something he had not permitted himself to feel in 2 years and had no intention of naming. That was the trouble. She had seen him from the first afternoon, more clearly than anyone had troubled to in 2 years, and being seen should have felt like relief. Instead, it had taught him to want the seeing to continue. Against every rule he had made since the fire, he had begun to expect her step on the stair and the ledger under her arm. Hope was not a thing he trusted anymore. He had felt it in the weeks before the stable fire, when he still believed himself entitled to a future he had not yet earned the right to want. Hope had not saved the stable boy. Hope had not kept his own hands whole. For 2 years, distance had offered him something hope did not. Limits he could understand, and fewer things left within reach to lose. Lady Prudence Halliway would ask very little of him. That was, he told himself at the tower window on the 3rd night of avoiding Nora, precisely the point in her favor. A marriage that asked nothing could not later demand what he no longer trusted himself to give. It was not cowardice, he insisted. It was arithmetic. What a man could reasonably promise weighed against what he could reasonably survive breaking. He did not examine why that arithmetic felt less clean than it had 6 weeks earlier, before a woman with steady hands began climbing his stair and leaving behind a silence he now noticed. The calculation still looked sensible on paper. It simply no longer felt like the whole truth once he imagined living inside it. On the second of those evenings, he heard Nora on the stair regardless. He knew the unhurried, purposeful rhythm now, though he had never decided to learn it. Before she reached the top, he crossed the room and turned the key. He stood on the wrong side of his own lock, like a man hiding from a debt collector, rather than a housekeeper with a ledger under her arm. Her steps stopped outside. For once, she did not knock. A moment later, they retreated. He told himself the relief he felt came from avoiding a conversation he did not want, and not from the fear of wanting that conversation badly enough to miss it when it was gone. The door stayed locked. The room felt larger after she left. Nora spent those same 4 evenings arriving at a different conclusion by a different road, though it delivered her to a destination no less bleak. She had come to Fenwick Grange to solve one problem, her family's latest debts, the cold arithmetic of 3 women depending on a wage she could not afford to lose. Somewhere in 6 weeks of clockwork and candlelight, she had allowed herself to become entangled in a second problem she had never been hired to solve and had no right to treat as hers. If Alistair knew who she was, the matter would at least be honest. He would be choosing to trust Nora Fairweather, the actual woman with the actual past, the brother who shouted in the drive, and the 6-year-old silence she had never explained. Instead, he was beginning, cautiously, to trust a stranger who was not a stranger at all. Every day she let pass made the ground beneath them less solid. The worst of it was that the trust itself had become precious to her. In the beginning, she had feared disclosure because dismissal would cost her family a wage. Now she feared it for another reason as well. Alistair might look at the woman he had begun to trust and decide the silence between them had made that trust impossible to keep. And now there was Lady Prudence Halloway, a formal letter, and a memorial in October that would force one decision or another whether Nora spoke or remained silent. She took her writing box out that night, the same box that held Silas's letter beneath the ledgers, and set a fresh sheet of paper in front of her. For a long while, her pen remained dry while she composed several possible openings of a letter of resignation. I regret that circumstances require me to give notice. I am grateful for the position, but find I must return to my family's affairs. I have realized I am not suited to the demands of this household. None of them were true, precisely. That was perhaps why none survived on the page for more than a half-formed line before she crossed it through and began again. A truthful letter would have required her to write that staying had begun to matter, and that leaving now seemed easier than discovering what the truth might cost once Alistair knew it. She did not finish the letter. She put the page away in the same box as everything else she had not yet found the courage to say aloud, then sat in the dark with her hands folded on the desk, listening for a sound from the tower that did not come. Peg found her there past midnight, come down for water, and startled to find the office candle burning so late. She had the good sense, for once, not to ask why the new housekeeper was sitting alone with an unfinished letter under her hand. She only set down her own candle to warm her fingers and said the house had felt strange these last few days, hushed differently from its ordinary silence, as though something in it had gone still that had only just begun to move. Nora agreed, sent Peg back to bed, and sat alone a while longer. She had come to Fenwick Grange meaning to be nothing more than useful. Somehow, without ever deciding to, she had become someone whose absence might be noticed. Worse, perhaps, she had become someone who would notice an absence in return. For a woman who had built 11 months around necessity and 6 years around silence, that was not a small thing to admit. She went up on the 5th evening without a ledger. She had decided this deliberately on the stair, because a ledger would have given both of them an excuse to talk about something other than the thing that actually wanted talking about. And she had run out. Somewhere in the last 5 days of folding linen and composing unfinished resignation letters, of patience for excuses. The stair felt longer than it had on any of her previous climbs, though the distance had not changed. She had spent the whole of it rehearsing and discarding and rehearsing again, the several different ways a woman might tell a duke he was behaving like a coward without using the word itself. Somewhere around the 4th step, she decided she did not actually intend to spare him the word. The door was locked again. She heard him on the other side of it, not moving, not pretending to be occupied with the clockwork, simply standing there, having already decided, before she'd finished climbing, how he meant to answer the sound of her on the stair. "I know you're in there," she said to the door, in a voice pitched to carry through wood but not through the rest of the house. "I'm not leaving until you open it, or until you tell me plainly, through the door if you must, why 5 days ago you could tell me about your mother's letter, and tonight You can't manage to turn a key. Nothing for a long moment. Then the lock, turning. He did not step back to let her in so much as simply stand aside. Crossing the threshold, she saw that the candles had not been lit in some hours. The room lit instead by the last gray light through the two tall windows. The clockwork on the table untouched. The whole space gone cold, the way a room goes cold when its occupant has stopped troubling to keep it warm. "I've written to my mother," he said, before she could speak, in the flat, preemptive tone of a man closing a door before anyone could ask to walk through it. Accepting the introduction. "It's done, Miss Fairweather. I don't know what you imagine there is left to discuss." "I'm not here to discuss Lady Prudence." "Then I confess I don't know what you're here to discuss at this hour without your ledger." Nora had rehearsed nothing on the climb up, on the theory that whatever she rehearsed would come out sounding rehearsed. And so, what came out instead came out unpolished, closer to the actual shape of what she meant. "I'm here because you've spent 5 days locking a door against a housekeeper who once held a brass plate steady for you at 1 in the morning. And I find I can't make that make sense with anything else I know about you. You are not a coward, Your Grace. I've watched you mend a mechanism with a hand that shakes so badly it takes you 3 tries to seat a single screw, and you don't stop trying. You don't lock the door on the clockwork when it refuses to cooperate. You only lock it, it seems, on people. That isn't fair." "It may not be fair. I don't know that it's wrong." She held his gaze and did not soften it, because softening it now would have undone the only useful thing she had left to offer him. "You've spent 2 years in this tower telling yourself it's safety. I'll not pretend to know everything that happened the night of the fire, or everything it cost you, because that isn't mine to claim understanding of. But I know what it looks like when a person decides that being small enough not to be noticed is the same thing as being safe. I watched my own mother do it for 11 months after my brother's latest debts became public. Shrink herself into corners of rooms she used to fill. Apologize for existing in her own house. And I promised myself I would never mistake that shrinking for safety in myself or in anyone I had cause to care about. And, Your Grace, I have cause." The words hung in the cold room longer than she'd meant them to. She had not intended to say the last of it, had intended to stop a sentence sooner at "anyone I had cause to care about," and let the specific application of it go unspoken. It was too late to take back once it was said, and she found, watching his face, that she did not entirely want to. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, finally, quieter than anything he'd said since she'd come in. "Lady Prudence asks nothing of me. That is not a small thing, Miss Fairweather, to a man who has very little left to give. You are asking me to be seen, fully, by someone who will notice when I fail at it, which I will more than once, because I am not the man I was before the fire, and I have no particular confidence I know how to be any other kind of man in his place. I'm not asking you to choose me." She said it steadily, though it cost her something to say it, given everything she had not yet told him and could not, in fairness, ask anything of him while withholding. "I haven't the right to ask you that, and I wouldn't, even if I did. I'm asking you to stop deciding in advance that hiding is the same as living, because it isn't, Your Grace. It's a different kind of dying. Slower, quieter, but I've watched you do it for 6 weeks now, and I find I haven't the stomach to watch it a season longer without at least saying so once, to your face, before I let the matter rest." He was quiet a long while after that. She let the silence hold because she had said what she had come to say, and had no further ammunition, honest or otherwise, to add to it. "There's a memorial," he said at last, neither an answer nor a refusal. "October, for the fire. My mother has been at me to attend it for a year, and I have found a reason to refuse every time it's been raised." "I know. I heard your mother discuss it with Mr. Aldridge some weeks past. Lady Prudence's family will be there. So, I gather, will most of the county, everyone who lost someone that night, everyone who has spent 2 years wondering whether the Duke of Wycliffe intends to go on hiding from a fire that wasn't, by any honest account, entirely his fault to carry alone." He looked at her, and something in his face had shifted from the flat, preemptive tone he'd opened with. Not resolved, not yet, but no longer entirely closed either. "I hadn't decided to go. And now?" "Now," he said, slowly, as though testing the shape of the decision before he fully committed his voice to it. "I find I am more tired of hiding from it than I am afraid of what it will cost me to stop." It was not a large sentence, measured against everything it would have to carry. A county's worth of curiosity, his mother's careful arrangements, 2 years of a door kept locked against exactly this kind of asking. But she watched something in his shoulders settle as he said it, the same settling she had seen once before, over a brass plate and a stubborn screw, and understood that she had witnessed, without quite meaning to orchestrate it, the precise moment a man stopped rehearsing his own disappearance. "Then I'll see the household prepared," she said, because it was the only steady thing she trusted herself to say, and because retreating into the practical had served her well enough, these 6 weeks, to trust it now. "Whatever Fenwick Grange can send with you in October, it will go creditably, Your Grace. I'll see to that much, at least." "That much," he agreed. "I don't doubt for a moment." She left him there, in the cooling room, and did not look back before she reached the stair. The whole way down, she was aware of his eyes on her back until the door swung shut between them, and aware, too, that she had bought them both perhaps a fortnight more before October arrived, and asked of her the one honesty she had not yet found the courage to offer freely. The memorial was held in the Whitcombs' long meadow, where a temporary dais had been raised beneath 3 great oaks, and the whole county, or near enough to it, had turned out in dark, respectful clothing to stand in the October cold and remember, formally, what the fire at Fenwick Grange had taken from them 2 years before. Nora had come with the household's small contingent, arranging flowers, seeing to the modest refreshment table Fenwick Grange had been asked to provide, the ordinary practical work that let her stand near enough to watch without appearing to watch at all. She had not expected, given everything she knew of him, that Alistair would arrive early. She had expected, if she was honest, some excuse delivered by messenger an hour before. Some sudden indisposition that would keep the tower door locked one further season. He arrived on time, in a plain dark coat, and did not stand at the back. Nora had spent the better part of the morning telling herself not to hope for even that much. That punctuality itself would be a victory. That she ought not expect anything grander than a man managing to arrive at all. So when his carriage came up the lane at the appointed hour, and he stepped down from it without hesitating, without the fractional pause she had half braced herself to see, something in her chest loosened that she had not fully realized was clenched. She felt the ripple of it move through the crowd before she consciously registered its cause. That hush which follows a name spoken in surprise, multiplied across 200 people at once. He walked the length of the meadow toward the dais without hurrying, without keeping to the shadow of the oaks the way she suspected. Watching him, that some smaller part of him wanted to, and he did not turn the scarred side of his face away from the crowd as he passed through it, though she saw, in the set of his jaw, precisely what that cost him. The service itself was simple. A vicar spoke of the fire in the plain, unornamented language such services favored, a night, a wind that had carried the flames faster than anyone had reason to expect, a stable roof that had given way before the last of the grooms could be got clear. Names were read, the stable boy's name among them, a boy of 14 called Thomas Reed, whose mother stood near the front of the gathering in a black bonnet gone slightly green with age, the only mourning clothes she owned worn now for the second time in 2 years. Nora watched Alistair's face at the reading of Thomas Reed's name and saw something pass across it that was not performance, was not the practiced grief of a man aware of being watched, but something private and unresolved that he made no attempt to arrange into a more presentable shape for the benefit of an audience. His jaw tightened. His eyes went, briefly, to the boy's mother, and away again, as if he had not yet decided whether he had earned the right to hold her gaze. It was afterward, in the looser gathering that followed the formal service, that the dowager found her opening. Constance Renshaw moved through the crowd with Lady Prudence Halliway at her side, a slight, fair young woman with a careful, pleasant expression that Nora found she could not fault in any particular, which made what came next considerably harder to watch than if Lady Prudence had been unkind. Alistair. The dowager's voice carried the bright, determined edge of a woman making an occasion of something before anyone present had agreed it was one. You remember I wrote to you of Lady Prudence. I think it very fitting, don't you, that you should be introduced properly today. Of all days, a fresh beginning, in the same breath as remembering. Alistair did not immediately answer. Nora, near enough to see it, and too far to be seen doing so, watched him look first at Lady Prudence. Politely, without unkindness, the look of a man taking honest measure of someone who had done nothing to deserve being made a pawn in whatever was about to happen, and then at his mother. Lady Prudence. He inclined his head to her directly, and his voice, when he addressed her, was gentler than Nora had expected, entirely without the flatness he kept for his mother. I hope you'll forgive me. I agreed to an introduction, and I am glad to have made it, and I am sorry that what I have to say next will make the introduction more public than either of us likely intended. Alistair. The dowager's brightness had gone brittle. This is neither the place nor— It is precisely the place, Mother. You chose it. He said it without raising his voice, which somehow carried further across the gathering than shouting would have. You have spent 2 years asking me to stand before people and let them look at me, and I have spent 2 years refusing, because I could not imagine what it would cost me to be looked at and found wanting. I find today that I am rather more tired of guessing what it would cost than I am afraid of learning the actual sum. He turned, then, so that he faced not only his mother and Lady Prudence, but the loose circle of county families who had drawn close enough, pulled in by the gravity of an unfolding scene, to hear the rest of it without pretending not to listen. I am not going to pursue a match with Lady Prudence, he said, without dressing it up. Not because there is any fault in her. There is none that I have found in the single conversation I have had the privilege of, but because I understand now that I agreed to it for the wrong reason. I wanted a marriage that would ask nothing of me. I have come to think a marriage that asks nothing is not a marriage at all, only an arrangement wearing its clothes. and Lady Prudence deserves considerably better than to spend her life married to a man's careful absence." He did not look toward Nora as he said it. She would think, replaying the moment many times in the weeks that followed, that this had been deliberate, that he had not wanted his next words read as a bargain struck in Lady Prudence's presence, one woman set against another in front of the whole county. As to the rest of it, he touched, briefly and without drama, the scarred side of his own jaw. Not a gesture asking for sympathy, Nora thought, but something closer to a man setting down a weight he had carried so long he'd forgotten it was optional. "I have spent 2 years assuming all of you had already decided what to make of this, and had simply been too well-mannered to say it aloud. I find I no longer have the patience to guess at your verdicts on my own behalf. I am the man the fire left. I am not going to apologize further for it, and I am not going to disappear on account of it, whatever anyone here has grown accustomed to expecting of me." The meadow was very quiet. Nora watched the reaction move through the gathered families. Not applause, not the swelling, sentimental hush of a crowd moved to admiration, which she understood, watching it happen, would have been its own kind of wrong, its own way of making a spectacle of a man who had asked, explicitly, not to be made one. What she saw instead was something quieter and, she thought, more honest. A few nods, a few glances exchanged. An older woman near the front, one of the mothers, perhaps, who had lost someone the same night Thomas Reed died, inclining her head to him with an expression that looked less like awe than like recognition. One person who had survived a hard thing acknowledging another. Lady Prudence, for her part, showed nothing but a small, unoffended nod, and something in her posture that looked, if anything, like relief. "Miss Fairweather." Alistair's voice, when he found her at last across the meadow, had none of the formal distance it carried for his mother. "Would you stand with me a moment? I find I've had more of being looked at today than I anticipated, and I would prefer not to manage the remainder of it alone." She crossed the grass to stand beside him, aware of every eye in the meadow following the crossing, aware that she was answering a question larger than the one he'd asked aloud, and that neither of them had yet said in so many words what that answer meant. He did not reach for her hand. He did not need to. It was enough, standing there in the cold October light with the whole county watching, that he had asked her to stay rather than to disappear, and enough for now that she had come. The dowager watched the two of them a long moment, her face working through something Nora could not fully read. Irritation, certainly, but beneath it something that might, with more patience than either of them currently possessed, come eventually to look like acceptance. She said nothing further. She took Lady Prudence's arm instead, with a briskness that suggested the retreat cost her considerable pride, and left the two of them standing together beneath the great oaks, in front of everyone, for the first time in 2 years, neither hidden nor apologized for. She waited 3 days after the memorial before she climbed the tower stair, with the truth finally decided upon, because she had learned, in 11 months of watching her family's ruin unfold in other people's drawing rooms, that a confession offered too quickly after a triumph looked like opportunism, however honestly it was meant. He was at the long table when she came in, not working the clockwork. The escapement had been finished for weeks, and the small spring he'd been waiting on had arrived only that morning, unopened in its paper on the corner of the table, but simply sitting, unmoving, 3 days into turning over the shape of what he'd said in the meadow, not yet decided what came next. "You didn't bring a ledger," he said, without turning. It had become, between them, something of a private joke, the ledger, a thing she brought when she wanted an excuse and left behind when she'd run out of needing one. No. She shut the door behind her, quietly, and did not sit, because what she had come to say felt like the kind of thing that ought to be said, standing. I've come to tell you something I should have told you the first week I arrived, and didn't because I was a coward about it, and I find I can't go on watching you learn to stop hiding while I keep doing exactly that myself. He turned at last, and something in his face, not alarm, precisely, but a kind of careful bracing, told her he had sensed, these last weeks, that something of this size had been waiting behind her steadiness. 6 years ago, she said, before she could lose the thread of it, I refused a proposal of marriage. I was 20. He was a younger son then, not yet a duke. His father was still living, and his elder brother, and no one imagined the title would ever come to him, least of all himself. He asked me in a garden in Somerset, at a house party. Neither of us had any particular business attending, and I told him no, and I would not tell him why, and I let him believe whatever a proud young man believes when a woman refuses him without explanation. I let him believe I did not love him. I did. That was never the true accounting of it. Alistair had not moved. She did not stop, because stopping now would have cost her whatever courage had carried her up the stair in the first place. The night before he asked me, my father told me, in confidence, that my brother had been caught cheating at cards in a manner that could not be quietly settled, that within the month it would be known across 3 counties, and that our family's name would not survive the telling of it. I did not know, that night in the garden, whether the scandal would ruin only us, or whether it would reach far enough to touch anyone unfortunate enough to be tied to us by marriage. I only knew that I loved a young man with a future ahead of him, that I had no right to gamble on my family's behalf. So I made the decision for both of us, without asking whether you'd have wanted a say in it. I have spent 6 years telling myself it was mercy, and knowing, more honestly, that it was also a kind of cowardice, because the truth would have cost me something to say, and silence did not. Nora. It was the first time he had used her given name without the courtesy title in front of it, and it landed in the cold room like something dropped from a height. I recognized you the first day I came up this stair, she went on, because she had promised herself the whole truth and intended to deliver it entire, without editing herself back into safety, now that the hardest part was said. You didn't recognize me. I understood why, eventually. I was 20 then, and different in a dozen small ways, and you'd had a fire between then and now that changed a great deal else besides your face. But I knew you the moment you turned round, and I said nothing, because by the time I understood who you were, I had already accepted a wage my family could not survive without. And telling you the truth felt, that first week, exactly like the kind of thing that would see me dismissed and my sisters go hungry for it. And then it was 2 weeks. And then it was the clockwork and the ledger, and I kept finding new cowardly reasons to let one more day pass without saying it, until it had become the very thing I promised myself, in that garden 6 years ago, I would never again let silence do on my behalf. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she began, despite everything she had told herself about not expecting forgiveness as a reward for honesty, to fear she had misjudged him badly, that the omission itself would outweigh, in his accounting, everything the original refusal had been meant to protect. I remember the garden, he said, finally, slowly, as though the memory were a piece of clockwork he was turning over to find its proper seat. I have not let myself think of it in years. It seemed, after everything since, a small and foolish grief next to the rest of what I'd lost. A young man's pride, wounded by a woman who'd had the sense to refuse him. I built a whole account of it in my head over the years. I decided you'd simply found someone you preferred, or grown tired of my company, or wanted more than a younger son with no particular prospects could offer you. I never once considered you might have refused me to protect me from something. It did not occur to me that a woman's silence could be that, rather than simple indifference. I didn't intend it to look like indifference. I only didn't know how to make it look like anything else, at 20, with my father's voice still in my ears telling me what was coming. And you've carried it since. 6 years, and then straight into this house, of all the houses in England, to find the very man you'd once tried to spare standing in a tower refusing to be looked at. Something that was almost a laugh moved through him, low and disbelieving, entirely without bitterness. I don't know what to call an arrangement like that. Providence seems too grand a word for it, and coincidence too small. I don't need you to call it anything, Your Grace. I needed you to know the truth of it, finally, whatever you decide to do with the knowing. He rose from the table then and crossed the room slowly, the way he crossed most distances now, without hurrying, and stopped near enough that she could see the fire had done nothing at all to the steadiness of his eyes, which she remembered, suddenly and completely, from a garden in Somerset 6 years gone. I am not going to pretend the omission cost nothing, he said. I found out from your own mouth, and not sooner, and I'll not insult either of us by claiming that doesn't sting somewhat, even now. But I have spent 2 years punishing myself for a fire I could not have stopped, on the theory that punishment was the same thing as honesty about what I'd become. I find I haven't the appetite left to punish you for 6 years of silence you spent, however imperfectly, trying to protect me. You were 20. You were frightened. You told me the truth the moment you found the courage for it, which is more than I can say I've managed most days, about my own face in a mirror. It was not forgiveness delivered as a gift, grand and immediate. It was something quieter than that, and steadier, and, she thought, standing in the cooling tower room with 6 years of unspoken truth finally out between them, considerably more like the man she remembered from the garden than anything she had let herself hope to find again. Thank you, she said, because it was the only honest thing left to say, and because for the first time in 6 years, the saying of it did not feel like a debt she still owed. They stood a while longer in the cooling room, neither of them quite ready to fill the silence with anything further, and Nora found she did not feel the need, as she once would have, to smooth it over with some practical remark about the household, some ledger conjured out of nowhere to give her hands something to do. It was enough, for the moment, to simply stand in a room she had climbed toward with dread and find, now that the dread had emptied out of her, that what remained underneath it was something closer to relief than to triumph, smaller than either, and built, she suspected, to last. There is still my brother to think of, she said eventually, because the practical part of her had not entirely gone silent even now. The debt he came here shouting about. I haven't solved that, telling you the rest of it. No, Alistair agreed, but it no longer seems to me a thing you're obliged to solve alone, which strikes me, tonight, as more than either of us had this time last week. She did not ask him what he meant to do about it. She found, climbing back down the tower stair some while later, that she did not need to ask, that the asking itself belonged to an older version of herself. the one who had spent 6 years assuming she must carry every difficult thing by herself or not at all. And that version of her, she thought, had finally been permitted to set something down. Silas's debt was not solved by any single grand gesture, which suited Nora better than the alternative would have. Alistair did not offer to simply discharge it, though she suspected, from the careful way he raised the subject, that the thought had occurred to him and been set aside deliberately. What he offered instead, through Aldridge and a solicitor in Bristol, Nora had never heard mentioned before that week, was a position, a genuine clerking post, with a wage modest enough to require discipline and oversight, strict enough to make further gambling far harder to hide. The debt itself was to be repaid in installments from Silas's own earnings over 3 years, with Aldridge's man checking the accounts quarterly. "It is not mercy," Alistair told her, when she asked, somewhat warily, whether her brother had understood the arrangement as the second chance it plainly was, rather than a rescue he could resent. "It is a ledger, same as any other. He'll pay what he owes, in the ordinary way people pay debts, and no one will hand him anything he hasn't earned the right to hold on to. I find I've very little patience left for rescues that ask nothing of the person being rescued. They rarely take." Silas had written once since, a shorter letter than his usual, with considerably less flourish in the hand, an acknowledgment of the position, a grudging thanks that did not overreach itself into promises he had broken too many times already to be trusted with. It was not forgiveness, precisely, on either side. It was closer to an accounting finally brought into balance, which Nora found, turning it over, was more than she had let herself hope for in October. The dowager took longer to come round, and did not, in the end, come round completely. But she came to Fenwick Grange twice in November, and on the second visit, she found Nora in the estate office going over the quarter's accounts, and did not sweep past her the way she had the first time, months before, but paused in the doorway a moment. "You've kept better books than any housekeeper this house has had in longer than I care to admit," Constance said, in the brisk tone of a woman who had decided, evidently, that this was as close to an apology as she intended to offer, and that it would have to serve. "I don't imagine that was an accident." "No, Your Grace, it wasn't." "No." The dowager studied her a moment longer, some old suspicion still visible beneath the surface of it, though much softened from what it had been. "Well, see that it continues," she said, and left it there, which Nora understood, from everyone she had come to know at Fenwick Grange, to be as generous a piece as the house was likely to offer anyone all at once. Lady Prudence, Nora heard some weeks later from Peg, who had it from a cousin in service at the Halloway estate, had accepted an understanding with a baronet's son from the next county over. A quiet, unremarkable courtship, by all accounts, entered into without any of the theater that had briefly threatened to attach itself to her name at the memorial. Nora was glad of it, honestly and without qualification. She had liked the small, unoffended nod Lady Prudence had given the two of them across the meadow, and was glad the young woman had found elsewhere exactly the undemanding steadiness she had once been offered here, and had lost, gracefully, without apparent regret. As for the tower room itself, it did not stop being what it was. Alistair's face did not change. The scars did not fade with the changing season, nor soften into some more forgiving shape as the story of his October courage made its slow way through 3 counties' worth of drawing rooms. Scars, Nora had come to understand, did not care what use a life afterward was put to. They simply remained exactly as the fire had left them, a fact of him, rather than a wound waiting on some final healing to make him whole. What changed on a bright, cold morning in early December was a smaller thing than the scars, and far more permanent. She found him at the tower window, with both casements thrown open to the actual weather for the first time since she'd come to the house. The real cold, the real light. No glass or curtain softening either. When she asked, half in jest, whether he meant to let the whole of winter into the room along with the view, he only glanced back at her with an expression she had come, in 4 months, to recognize as entirely his own. "I've had the windows shut 2 years," he said, on the theory that the less anyone saw of this room, the less they'd trouble themselves wondering what was inside it. I find I no longer care to keep the theory. Let them wonder. Let them see, if they trouble to look up as they cross the drive. There's nothing in this room, I mean, to go on hiding. She crossed to stand beside him at the open window, and the wind off the meadow was sharp enough to sting, and neither of them moved to shut it out. If you stayed with Nora and Alistair all the way to that open window, thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like the video. It helps this channel reach more listeners who love a slow-burn romance as much as you do. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next release. And down in the comments, we'd love to know, what moment in this story stayed with you the longest? We read every one. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next story.